my Rhino Roach and her babies. Invertebrate dude, I made you a promise. I think it was on my YouTube channel. You talked about how you really wanted some Rhino Roaches, and I told you, because of all of your wonderful contributions to the hobby, that I would give you a pair of them the next time some were born. Happy birthday. Here it is, Macropanesthia rhinoceros, the rhino cockroach, or rhinoceros cockroach, or giant litter bug, or just the litter bug, the giant burrowing cockroach. There are many common names for this amazing species. They are the heaviest roach in the world. This here is an adult male. He's not particularly large. Sometimes they're considerably larger than this. I've had ones where the male was twice the mass of this one. He was maybe this much longer, and then maybe, I don't know, another 50% as wide as this one. A lot of variation in the size of this very long-lived. They can live a decade, actually. This one here was actually born about 8.5 years ago. Because of their long lifespan, it takes quite a while for this species to mature. 3 to 5 years on average. And then in turn, it can take them 6 years before they first reproduce. And of course, this is the cockroach that everybody wants, and there are a few reasons for that. They are very rarely sourced. They only produce one batch of babies per year, and despite living so long, most people only get one brood out of them during the entire course of their lifetime. I have a female that you will see later that has produced for us twice now, and again, she is the same age as this male, 8.5 years old. So their long lifespan, their size being the heaviest roach in the world, and again, this is a small specimen, along with their time to maturity, along with the rarity again, ensures that they will always have a very high value. And many of you who are familiar with the species will already know how expensive they are. A lot of people who are not familiar with them may be surprised to learn that a sexed pair of these has a value of about $1,000, and I have sold numerous pairs at that price point in the past. More typically, younger ones are offered as babies, usually second instars. You'll see some babies a few times, I think, in this video. A little later, they're paler. They don't have the coloration of this adult here, but they darken up, and once they molt that first time, they're a lot more stable for shipping, moving around. So care. Aren't a lot of YouTube videos out there on care, and no discussion of care can really be had without recognizing the nearly 2 decades of work by my friend Oren McMonigal in documenting the growth and reproduction life history for these as pets here in the hobby. And he's been raising them generationally now for about 20 years. Much of this is summarized in his book, For the Love of Cockroaches, and I highly recommend anybody who is making a serious attempt with these gets a copy of that book. It is available on my website, and I will be sure to include a link to that down in the caption or description area below this video. I had the honor of editing that book for him, and I actually wrote the back cover, the foreword, I guess you call it, for the book as well. A very long book, a very detailed book, and a lot of species are covered. And I would say that his work in documenting the care and reproduction of the rhino roaches, what he writes in that book, is probably the absolute best source of information in the world. And that in terms of reproducing them in captivity, he is a world authority on the topic, of course. Oren is a friend, and probably no other person has contributed as much to the pet roach hobby or the pet insect hobbies in general. His books have been a source of inspiration and information for us for many years, and it's just been a real pleasure to have entered the hobby at around the same time as him, and to have worked together to promote the hobby, the pet insect hobby, not just here in the United States, but through roachforum.com, a forum that we work on jointly all these years, and the Mantis forum called mantidforum.net, and then Beetle Forum. Just a wonderful set of resources for the hobby, and much of that started because of Oren's early work in promoting the US hobby. So care. Care is broken down into two methods. In nature, this species, they're called burrowing cockroaches. It's true that they live in burrows, but not so true that they are constantly burrowing like a lot of our other hobby roach nymphs. Interestingly shaped eyes. They seem more reduced in this species, perhaps because they spend a lot of time underground. Macropanesthia rhinoceros. So they will live in a burrow, but it's more like a tank underground with a tunnel that goes out to the surface where they go out to gather leaves and wood, and they drag that back into their burrow to feed on. The tank that we set up for them is much like what might be considered the main chamber, where they hang out and spend a lot of time. And the two methods are a deep substrate or a shallow substrate tank setup. Following Oren's advice many years ago, I opted to use the shallow substrate method. And that was largely because of his recommendation and his experience that sometimes the immatures, as they molt, have problems in the burrows. And you can't really see what's going on down there if they are subterranean, of course. And that can be an obstacle too. Sometimes in an underground burrow, they will flip over on their backs if the burrow is large. And if there isn't something down there for them to grab onto, they have trouble flipping themselves back over, and so they tire themselves out. This can happen too up on the substrate surface in a shallow tank even. And so I recommend that if you're going to do a deep substrate, which a lot of keepers around the world do because it is more natural probably for the roaches to live in a kind of setup like that, that you bury something like this in the substrate so that the roach, it's called a half log hide, so that the roach can safely remain under there. And if you haven't constructed the substrate or mixed it in such a way so that it is less likely to collapse in on itself, these burrows, tunnels that they dig, that they won't be affected by that. So in the shallow substrate that you'll see featured through all of the video clips that come after this talking portion, you will see my shallow substrate. And I do recommend that you have some things up there on the surface, perhaps like cork bark hides, slabs of cork bark, bits of bark, maybe branches. Not so many things that the roaches can't move around through them, but in case this roach were to flip on its back, it would have a lot of trouble, like a tortoise, in flipping itself back over. You see it was able to do that there because it was able to reach down and hook into my hand, and it did it there again very quickly. Well, they can dry out in a few days' time for an adult like this, much more quickly for a younger nymph because the cuticle on these roaches is very thick. I don't know how to demonstrate that. I don't want to flick the roach, even though it wouldn't bother the roach. It would bother a lot of people if I did something like that, so I won't do it. But that's something that you want to pay attention to if you're running a shallow substrate. A deep substrate that is misted or a little water poured into it perhaps to keep it hydrated will keep the roaches from drying out. But in a shallow substrate, you need to be misting in there every couple of days, maybe pouring a little water into the substrate. These roaches do really like to drink. And if you're keeping your tank dry, you'll notice that they have a lot more interest in drinking if you offer them water by way of a little shallow water dish in some cases if you want to. It has to be very shallow, and I recommend very small. You don't want them to drown in it, certainly. But you'll see some of the types of water dishes that I use. It's just a drinking cap, like from a milk jug or a water jug or a Gatorade lid, things like that. And it doesn't need to have water in it at all times, but whenever I open the tank, I generally add a little bit of water to that. Gonna come back and have another drink. Yes, still thirsty. Just a sip. See those fine hairs back there behind her head? Orange, bristly CT. She's very big, very thick. The orange intersegmental coloration there, that's a sign of how thick she is right now. She's going to give birth very, very soon. This is a rhino roach. Can live for 10 years. You see those feet modified, different than many other roaches. These are burrowers. And so those hard bristles on the legs aid them in digging. And we'll talk about feeding here again in a moment. If you're going to offer them a deep substrate, definitely put in this kind of hide and go ahead and stack substrate up on top of that, maybe 8 inches of substrate if you want to. But again, I like the shallow substrate simply because that's the only kind of substrate that I've ever used on Oren's recommendation, and I've never had a single mismolt in that case. You may want to limit the number of roaches in terms of the immature specimens that you have in the tank at once. I never have adult males in the tank at any point. They're big and bulky, and they'll run around and maybe disturb a molting female or a molting nymph. The only time that I ever have adult males in the tank with other roaches is when I'm breeding a female. And sometimes I'll leave the males in there for 6 months at a time. It just depends on how many females I have to pair him up with. How many males I have, how many females I have, factors like that. It's okay to keep the males and females together, but at some point I do eventually move the male out of the female's tank when I'm reasonably sure, and you can be reasonably sure within a week or two, that they have paired up if they're going to. They have mated, I mean. So I sort of have a feeling that the females don't like having the males in the tank harassing them all of the time once they have been fertilized. And so I'll typically move the male around from female to female, or leave him alone if I'm relatively certain that. And it's best, of course, if you have actually witnessed them mating to know how to move him around and when to move him around. So there is a concern that males, adult males, left in the tank will cannibalize the young. I have never personally experienced that because Oren has documented that as happening, and the nymphs being as valuable as they are, I never want to take a chance that I'm going to lose a single one to cannibalism. Also, adult females and males can basically trounce or trample the young molting nymphs. And so generally, I leave the babies in with the female, their mother, and you'll see later in this video some of her maternal care for them. I'll leave them together until the babies molt their first time, and they go from that pale coloration to a darker coloration. And I'll show you what a darker nymph looks like here now. Here are two specimens, our adult male on the left there, and then here on the right, the darker nymph. When they mature, they take on that sort of reddish coloration. And before that, they are always this dark color, with the exception of when they are first born, they are completely white, and then they sort of darken up to sort of a straw color. Well, after that first molt, they are this color at all times, a nice glossy dark brown color, until they mature, when they are this reddish color. And that's a sign, of course, that they are mature. Hard to hold at this angle. I'm gonna get this little one put back here, and then we'll just continue on with the video and this large one here. So despite being burrowers, in our pet tanks, we tend to keep them on the shallow substrate. And perhaps the main reason for doing that is we can keep an eye on them. We can see how they're doing, and they seem to grow and reproduce better in those cases. We can see what they need and have a better understanding for what the humidity is like, because in the shallower substrate, it's drying out more frequently. We're just adding food up to the top of the substrate. We can see when the food needs to be replaced. We can tell if they're thirsty or not by whether they're drinking or not. And the funny thing is that keeping them on that shallower substrate, because it does dry out more often, and that depends on the ventilation in your lid, of course, but through having to check on them more regularly, we really probably provide them better care than if they were burrowed and we couldn't see them. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not so much about what the animal prefers in nature or naturally, but the level of care that we are more likely as their keepers to provide for them through being able to see them and observe what they are up to. So I personally offer them probably a greater variety of foods than most people do. I'm not really sure if that's true or not, but from my reading and through talking to people, it seems like, and really the majority of their diet consists of leaves. In Australia, they feed on a few different kinds of leaves, but eucalyptus is the one most often cited. And a lot of keepers will feed them eucalyptus in captivity. I think there are some concerns about what kind of eucalyptus to use. I never personally use eucalyptus. Here in the United States, most people will use oak or other kinds of hardwood leaves. I have found, and many of the people who I have supplied leaves to over the many years I've been offering all of these bug products, have told me that the big leaf maple leaves that I supply, and it has been my experience as well, are the favorite of these rhino roaches. And so that's pretty much exclusively the leaves that I use now. Sometimes if I find an oak tree I will grab some leaves and throw them in there just supplementally. More because I guess we aren't ever really sure what they like, what they need. And I have always had this sort of tendency to try to provide them with a variety of things, just under the suspicion or concern, or call it superstition if you will, that maybe they just need that one little trace mineral or something that's in this other food and they haven't been getting that. Primarily besides the big leaf maple, which should be dry and on the ground, collected in the fall, really dried out over the course of the next 6 months to the point where they are so dry you can crumble them. I see a lot of people setting their tanks up and they just drop the whole leaves into the tank. And I've never offered whole leaves unless you're wanting to provide ground cover for things, which is fine in the case of these and isopods and millipedes and things like that, because it does create a little micro habitat where humidity is more likely to remain a little bit higher. But I crush the leaves up that I'm feeding to them into rather fine bits because they like to pick them up in their mouths and eat them, carry them off in some cases. If you have that half log hide, which I tend to have in my shallow tanks too, they'll often crawl back under that and do their feeding under that. Crush those leaves up into fine bits, and then I give them a little mist on top just to kind of soften them up a little bit. The roaches are pretty responsive both to the freshly added leaves and the moisture, and they'll often just sort of go right for them, and particularly if it's been a longer amount of time since you fed. I also supplement them with some fermented oak flake soil just because I tend to have it around, and it seems like almost any pet bugs just love that stuff. And these are documented as also being wood feeders or bark feeders in nature. And so I think that's an important ingredient to have in there just for their health. And then I supplement with carrots rather often. Jelly cups. Jelly cups are always in my cages. And partly because I run the shallow substrate, and that always increases the risk that, if I don't come back to the cage for maybe a week or so, that these roaches aren't going to dry out. They have some source of hydration. I also put in apple, zucchini, and then some people will feed dog food, maybe cat food, protein-based pet foods. I use cichlid fish food pellets pretty much exclusively for all my pet bugs, and the mini pellets, M-I-N-I pellets in particular, because they're very small and the animals can carry them off and feed on them. And in a communal tank where you might have multiple nymphs, for example, of this species, they don't have to share them and worry about biting each other's antennae or fight over them. Now, these roaches aren't big feeders on anything but leaves, and I offer those supplemental foods rather sparingly. Every time I do feed them, I do offer them, but I'm talking about just a couple little, tiny bits of carrot and a few cichlid fish food pellets. They do go after the jellies, the roach jellies or the beetle jellies, doesn't really matter which. Their ingredients are pretty much the same anyway, just kind of a sugary drink for them. And so that's something that I always have in the tank for them. There are times where I might go a month without opening the tank. Pretty rare. I try to check on them weekly, but the nymphs are certainly much more likely to desiccate or dry out than these adults with their thick cuticle. And so the adults I check on less frequently. The babies, of course, are very important. When I have them born, I'm not going to retain them for myself. I am going to sell them. And so it's important that I'm being very careful. Dryness is the most likely thing that is going to cause them to die. And of course, being as valuable as they are, well, you get the point. The remainder of this video is going to be about courtship and breeding these roaches, and you'll get to see lots of interesting little behaviors that the male who is recently introduced into the female's cage has as he adjusts to his surroundings and makes first contact with her, and then how they respond to each other during that process, and then culminating, of course, in the end with the two of them breeding and then offspring being reproduced. Please enjoy the video. If you have any questions, please ask your questions down below. I really appreciate the comments. These are time-consuming videos for me to make, but I really enjoy making them, and I really enjoy the interactivity of replying to the comments down below. Thank you guys very much for watching.
The purpose of this video is to show the difference between the thickness of these two roaches. This one here is much thicker, and I do believe she is going to produce 20 to 30 babies very soon. These are rhino roaches. Very, very sought after by hobbyists. Pet roaches. You can see their legs are modified for burrowing. What's under the leaves? Well, this is one of the tanks for my rhino roach females, and she's over here patiently waiting for this adult male who I just placed in her tank about 30 minutes ago, and he has pretty much torn the whole thing upside down, burrowing around. Kind of interesting. He's spent the last 6 months with another female, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the next hour or so he ends up breeding with this female. Thought I'd take a quick video of it here because this is just a good example of one of the exciting things that I do here when I'm not packing up orders for my pet bug customers. Sort of a business related thing, but I mean, who doesn't love rhino roaches in one capacity or another? These ones have been in my life for about 8 years now. The species lives about 10 years. And come back and check in a few moments, see if maybe some breeding action is going on. He is a powerful insect. You can see that he's been moving this half-log hide around. You see it moving just slightly there. This is a weighty piece of wood, and he's a big boy. And she's pretty good sized herself. So patient. We'll see. It appears that he is starting to explore these new surroundings a little bit. Briefly went over and checked on the female. Interestingly, she seems pretty interested in having him in the tank with her now. It's a pretty good sign. Don't know if this means anything at all, or if he's just going wherever he wants to go. There's a small chance, I suppose, that he will just crawl right under her, and then they'll both be in the right position to breed. See his antennae moving around back there quite a bit. And, I mean, can't say for sure, but that looks pretty friendly for two roaches that haven't been together before. Let's see what happens next. Really, all we need to see is that he moves out from underneath of her, and then the tip of his abdomen is near the tip of her abdomen. And I've seen this species mate before. Got some video footage of it at one time. But I missed seeing the precursors, the courtship to mating, and it doesn't necessarily look like much here, but I suppose if anybody has a male and a female rhino roach, it's already exciting. And you can see now that his antennae were gently moving back and forth across the end of her abdomen there. Really seems to be burrowing a lot now, this male. In the cage he was in before, I wasn't seeing this behavior, and so this is kind of interesting and different here, this interest in burrowing, and it might just be that he's exploring her cage because it's new to him, or perhaps this has something to do with courtship in some way that we can't understand. I will not be at all surprised if I stop filming this and then come back a moment later and I've missed everything and the two of them are linked up breeding. You can almost imagine that maybe there is something happening on a chemical or pheromone level. I'm not really sure, but maybe she is signaling to him in that kind of way that she is receptive to his advances. Time will tell. We'll check back. I don't know. To me, really looks like these two are positioning themselves to breed. I mean, that is just the perfect orientation there. And just the tips of their abdomens, they're so close. And I mean, she couldn't be in a better position. She's facing directly away from them because when roaches mate, they are tip of abdomen to tip of abdomen. So I'm taking this footage with the flash off. No light. Can you hear the male stridulating? He is pushing air, I believe, in and out of his spiracles, the breathing holes that run the length of his abdomen on either side. It's been 8 minutes now since he's been oriented towards her in this way and stridulating. This is the first time that I've seen rhino roaches courting in this way, and so it's a pretty neat moment when you consider that these things are 8 years old. And the story behind this pair, I've told it previously, but since this will be included in a larger video about rhino roaches, I'll tell the story again. I acquired this pair when they were 3 years old, and during the purchasing process, I had asked the person I was buying them from, and this was about 5 years ago now. I asked him, well, where did you get them from? And he said, well, I bought them from you as babies. Now, this is the moment that we're waiting for right here. They're so nearly lined up. It's when they are facing away from each other that they usually link up, almost so that their bodies are in a straight line, heads opposite one another and abdomens lined up. She's very receptive, but for some reason, he doesn't seem to be getting himself lined up properly. Whoa, did you see that? It's the female, and if that's not an invitation, wait a second. This is very interesting. The opposite of an invitation is an offering. And, well, I don't think I have to say it. You know what that was. That doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad thing. Doesn't necessarily mean it was anything more than a coincidence either. But it could be a part of the courtship process. I don't know how many people have seen rhino roaches courting before. Could be something that happens every time. It could be an obstacle in some way to what happens next, an obstacle that no longer exists. I'm not really sure, but you can see down in the tank there that there are dried fecal pellets. And that darker one, of course, is, well, fresh. And now, perhaps with that out of the way, the situation will move forward. So you can see now that his head is very near to that fresh fecal pellet, and now to the tip of her abdomen. And perhaps one more turn around and they'll be in the right position. There are 3 things in this particular frame, 4 if you count the cork bark, which are of interest currently. 2 roaches, a fecal pellet, and the cork bark. It will be interesting to see what happens next. And so he has turned his abdomen again. She turns her abdomen again. There appear to be some leaves there in his way. Now you can see her moving her abdomen. Closer and closer to him. Trying to give you guys a better angle on this here. There you have it. were connected for just a moment, but then lost the connection. You can see the difference in the pronotum of the male and the female. She has a bit of a scoop up there, but the bumps on the top side of her pronotum, that first segment there over the head, doesn't have as prominent bumps as the male. And that scoop that goes over the head almost forms what looks like a rhino horn in the male. Juts upwards a bit. Definitely seems to be some grazing of that section of the female's body with the male's antennae. I'm just letting the documentation, the video go on and on, because there isn't a lot of footage out there of any of this, and this may be terribly interesting to 2 or maybe 3 people on the planet, in addition to me. Well, here he comes out from under all of that. She's managed to get the tip of her abdomen quite dirty by this point. And I'm sure he's not going to be looking his finest after digging through dirt like that. Who knows? Roaches are looking pretty dirty, but I'm going to keep the video as clean as possible. At some point, I need to turn the camera off and work on other things, but it sure has been interesting to watch this. And I'm confident that there will be babies soon. Had this male in with another female a little bit ago, and I pulled him out, and because she had obviously been fertilized, it was obvious to me. And this one here, he had mated with her, and I pulled him out on June 14th, so 7 months ago, and just reintroduced him with this female. She was looking thin compared to the other one, and now they're hooked up and mating.
I always like roaches, but when I do like roaches, I like these roaches. Australian rhino roaches. And babies. Dun dun dun.
And the mother here, she is covering them because she's showing maternal instincts. They leave, some of them, and then they come back. She senses my presence, and so she's protecting her little ones. Put some food in there for them. I don't imagine that they'll eat here in the first 24 hours. They've darkened up some, but they were born within the last 24 hours because I checked in this cage just yesterday. Mother is out, checking around, looking for some food. She's had a very busy 24 hours, and I tried to give her a little bit of water there, but she felt threatened. Going to dribble just a little bit down here. Put some more over there. We don't want to make this so deep that the babies could drown in.
We know from caring for many other young invertebrates that even the adhesion from the water can cause them to drown. They can molecularly become attracted and stuck in it. So she'll come back here and drink in a moment. I'll set this aside. And she keeps coming back to this corner, but her babies have really dispersed out there on their own here. Just a little bit. Maybe looking for a drink or a little bite of food. Don't imagine that their mandibles are sclerotized quite enough yet to feed. They do come out. The eyes and the mandibles tend to have a little more sclerotization than the rest of the body. So I'm going to go and get some more leaves and crush them up in here. That's favorite food of the rhino roaches. One from last fall. The babies are very prone to desiccation. It's probably the most common cause of death for them, and so going to be checking on them regularly, watching and waiting for them to shed their skin one time. At that point, they will approximate the coloration of their mother with the cuticle, and they'll be a lot more stable and resistant to desiccating or drying out. One of the tricks to helping them to stay hydrated is to put in some kinds of ground cover like this. It creates little microclimates here in the tank beneath them. There, the mother is wondering, what is this very large thing that just appeared in the tank? So, we'll pop the lid back on here, and we'll check on them again in a few days. It's been a few days since these were born, and before I took the lid off the cage, the nymphs were all out on top of these things, just sort of dispersed, but Mom's coming out. She's looking around, see what's going on, what the disturbance is all about. You can see that the substrate in here is consisting largely of her fecal pellets at this point. And I'm going to pull the female out of the cage here after these nymphs all shed their skin one time and take on that darker coloration. And I'm going to move the mother into a new cage with a mix of coconut fiber and sand as the substrate. You can see here that
I only have it about 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep. And that's the shallow substrate that I keep them on. And she's 8.5 years old. It would be wonderful if I can get her up to the 10-year mark. We'll see what happens, and I'll keep you guys updated on that. And we'll be watching to see how long it takes for these babies to shed their skin the first time. And I'm guessing it will be somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks from now. And then I might start moving some of them off to other people. Well, let's just take a peek under here. And the mother's here. I never actually counted how many babies were born. I had counted before when she reproduced that there were 33 babies. You can see that some of them are burrowed into the substrate here. You can also see that, with the exception of that one bit of carrot, nearly everything else, oh, there's a dried bit right there, but everything else I had put in the tank is pretty much gone, including every little bit of leaf litter and most of the carrot and some of the zucchini.
No, I did not.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm making my Rhino Roach video here, and Jesse there, Shapes in Nature, he brought over the Rhino Roach stickers. Check that out.
Where else are you going to get a Rhino Roach sticker?
Not one this good. That is amazing. And the Goliath beetle stickers, and another slightly related topic, the Australian giant prickly. Goes under different names, but look at the coloration on that. But really happy to have received these on the very day that I'm making the Rhino Roach video. The video is like an hour long.
Is it really?
It's crazy long. Courtney, you're gonna watch the whole thing.
Of course I am. I'll watch all of them.
And then you're not gonna hit the like button.
That's not like
Thanks anyway.
That's not like...
Hey, if you like me, give me one of those thumbs up. And please subscribe and hit the little bell so you know when I post next. Please share me with your friends on social media. Thank you for watching.